The siege on a Hong Kong university enters its seventh day. Inside are dozens of pro-democracy activists, some desperately wanting to escape, others vowing not to surrender. Tensions rise in Colombia. Demonstrators defying a curfew ordered by Iván Duque, protesting outside of the president's home. And thousands of people across France will march later today protesting domestic violence, which has already left more than 100 women dead so far this year. We begin in Hong Kong, the siege on a campus entering its seventh day. Riot police have surrounded Polytechnic University, while several dozen protesters remain holed up inside. It's been the site of some of the most intense violence since the anti-government demonstrations began 5 months ago. Around 1,000 people have been arrested, and some protesters have surrendered in the past few days. Oliver Ferry reports on what the conditions are like inside Polytechnic.
According to reports from journalists who have got inside, the conditions are pretty bad now. The hygiene conditions in particular have deteriorated. There does seem to be a drop in the amount of food available, but then of course with so many having been arrested or left the campus in recent days, there are fewer mouths to feed as well. The police do seem to be trying to wait it out. The new chief of police, Chris Tang, who just came into the job this week, says he wants to see a peaceful resolution to the siege. And for the moment, the police do not seem to be intent on taking it by force like they tried to last weekend. We're not exactly sure how many people are inside. There's probably at least a few dozen. In fact, probably some people on the inside are not too sure either, as they appear to have broken off into smaller groups, becoming a little bit distrustful of one another. And they're not all the same level, really. You know, some are obviously more hardcore than others, and some are people who just got themselves stuck in there, and they're probably terrified at the prospect of going to prison, because they do face charges of rioting, and that could be up to 10 years in prison under Hong Kong law.
Well, residents of the Pacific Island chain of Bougainville are casting ballots over the next 2 weeks, choosing between greater autonomy within Papua New Guinea or full-blown independence. The long-awaited referendum could lead to it becoming the world's youngest nation. The vote is a cornerstone of a 2001 peace deal that had ended a brutal decade-long war between local rebels, security forces, and foreign mercenaries. 20,000 people were killed in that conflict. Now, many are hoping to turn the page.
It's obvious that the people are now in the mood of celebration, and I join them very much. They have every right to celebrate, because this is a forecast or the beginning of good things to come.
I am so happy to see this day happen. The opening of the vote for independence, I'm just so happy.
In Colombia, protesters defied a curfew in the capital, Bogota, by picketing outside the president's home. Meanwhile, soldiers walking the streets elsewhere in the city. 3 people were killed during nationwide demonstrations on Thursday. The country grappling with long simmering tensions over issues like corruption and inequality. After 15 months in office, President Iván Duque has seen his approval rating plummet to just 26%. Monty Francis has more.
As the clock ticked past a 9 p.m. curfew, thousands of protesters refused to leave Bogota's Bolivar Plaza. At the same time, neighbors organized to protect their homes from looters.
There are more good people, as our neighbors say, than bad. We're protecting our property, our family, our neighbors, and that's the most important thing.
Angry over possible labor and pension reforms, demonstrators are calling for the resignation of President Iván Duque and former President Alvaro Uribe, who remains leader of the right-wing Democratic Center Party.
I'm here for the same reason all Colombians are here. We are tired of Mr. Duque. We are tired of Ms. Uribe. They are a pair of liars. They never do what they are going to do. It's the worst government since I can remember.
Mass marches in the country on Thursday resulted in several deaths and hundreds wounded. In response to the unrest, President Duque has deployed thousands of soldiers in major cities across Colombia.
I have decided to strengthen police presence and increase intelligence capacities. I've ordered the deployment of mixed patrols of both the police and the National Army in the most critical areas.
But the president's words have failed to calm protesters, now part of a wave of unrest sweeping across South America.
In Chile, a 13-year-old boy was run over by a van during protests in Arica, pushing the overall death toll from violent unrest to 23. Protests entering a fifth week. There's been widespread anger over social and economic inequality as well as a ruling elite. The crisis is the worst in 3 decades of the country's democracy and has led to around 2,000 injuries, including some 280 people who suffered eye damage from shotgun pellets. Well, Bolivia's interim government is to hold talks with protesters this Saturday in hopes of quelling tensions. The country has been in turmoil since disputed elections in October. At least 32 people have been killed. Former President Evo Morales has been accused of sedition and terrorism. James Wilson reports.
Terrorism and sedition, the latest accusations leveled at former Bolivian President Evo Morales by the country's new interior minister. Meanwhile, as roadblocks prevent fuel and food reaching Bolivia's cities, interim President Añez did not mince her words.
I profoundly regret what the city of La Paz is going through. La Paz residents don't deserve a blockade so that fuel can't come in.
On Saturday, Bolivia's Congress will schedule a new election, something the government hopes will calm a country where dozens of people have died in clashes between police and protesters.
We can't leave the nation in a vacuum. The lady president has a time limit, and that hole must be filled.
People are still a little worried because they blame the current president. I believe that if she calls for elections, people will relax and hopefully this time there won't be any kind of fraud.
Evo Morales' transformative 3 terms as president mean for the Bolivian left he will always be a hero. But his own Movement for Socialism party has said neither he nor his former vice president will be the party's candidate in the upcoming election, meaning whatever the result, the country will enter a new political era.
U.S. President Donald Trump has criticized the first week of public testimonies in the impeachment inquiry against him. Trump is accused of abusing power by asking Ukraine's leader to investigate his political rival Joe Biden. This week saw 12 witnesses testify. Here's a clip of the interview he gave to Fox and Friends.
Should never, ever impeach. This is not impeach. I watched 5 people on your network yesterday say there's nothing here. They tried to overthrow the presidency. This is a disgrace. But I'm not surprised to see it. It's just starting to come up. I think this is nothing compared to what you'll see over the next couple of weeks.
Tens of thousands of Algerians took to the streets and demanded the cancellation of the December 12th election. This, the 40th consecutive Friday. Demonstrators say the polls rigged in advance, ensuring that remnants of the old regime can cling to power. Selena Sykes has more.
Chants calling for change ring out on the streets of Algiers as protesters demonstrate for the 40th consecutive Friday. They're demanding the cancellation of the country's presidential election in mid-December.
The people are saying no to these elections. They're not against having elections, but they are against these corrupt people. They're against those who are organizing them, those who steal from the people.
For demonstrators, the vote in 3 weeks' time is a ploy to keep the political elite linked to former President Abdelaziz Bouteflika in power. Each of the 5 candidates running in the December 12th election held positions in Bouteflika's government. He was forced out in April after mass protests broke out against his bid for a 5th presidential term. Protesters are also demanding the military to distance itself from politics.
They're trying to recycle the same system. It's out of order. We won't let them do it. We want a new, democratic Algeria, a country with laws, rights, and freedom of expression.
Dozens of demonstrators have been arrested since the beginning of the election campaign. The rise in arrests has not dissuaded protesters. They vowed to take to the streets again next Friday.
Today, people will march across France protesting violence against women. It comes ahead of a new series of measures expected to be rolled out on Monday. So far this year, more than 130 women have died from domestic violence. Solange Moujon tells us the story of one woman who has written about what it's like to be in an abusive relationship.
In 3 hours, I'm going to beat you up. Yassine sat down in front of the TV. This morning, I didn't do things right. One of his eggs wasn't perfect.
For 4 years, Morgan Saliman was the victim of domestic violence. Abuse that she writes about in her book, He Stole My Life. Published in 2015, she describes the psychological and physical torture that thousands of women in France are still subjected to.
It's 10 o'clock in the morning. He'd say to me, in 4 hours, I'm going to beat you. And all morning, he'd repeat it. In 3 hours, you've only got 2.5 hours left. Think hard about what you did. 2 hours, 1 hour, 30 minutes, and then 10 minutes before he'd say, you've only got 10 minutes left.
Morgan filed a complaint with the police 12 times against her partner at the time, before he was finally sentenced to a year behind bars.
When I'd file a complaint, the police would say he'll be brought in 3 weeks' time. That isn't reassuring. It's in the right now. It's that second, and not in 3 weeks when maybe things will be right again. How do you go home just to be left wondering, are the police going to come or not?
Upon his release, Morgan's former companion tracked her down and beat her up again. It took years for her to feel a semblance of safety. For her, the government's idea of putting tracking bracelets in place to enforce restraining orders is a good step, as long as the surveillance, she says, is focused on the abusers and not the victims.
Well, Britain's 4 major parties took part in a televised debate. While the Conservatives are ahead in the polls, next month's general election remains one of the most unpredictable ones in decades. That's because many voters are now more attached to their positions on Brexit rather than traditional party politics.
A 4-way grilling at a Brexit-heavy debate. First to take to the podium, Jeremy Corbyn defended what he calls a radical manifesto, seeking to renationalise rail, energy and other services. The Labour leader used the opportunity to finally clarify his position on Brexit.
I will adopt, as Prime Minister, if I am at the time, a neutral stance so that I can credibly carry out the results of that to bring our communities and country together.
This came as Boris Johnson blamed his rivals for the current deadlock.
The failure of politicians to deliver Brexit. Because the people...
As the Prime Minister likened critics of a report into Russian interference in the referendum to conspiracy theorists.
There is absolutely no evidence that I know of.
If that's the case, then why not release it?
To show any interference in any British electoral event.
And while some are offering a people's vote or to get Brexit done, the Liberal Democrats are committed to scrapping Brexit altogether.
We can disagree with each other. So we've argued for a people's vote.
Okay,
and
but
in
then
this
what
election,
do you
we're
say?
saying if you vote Liberal Democrat and get a Lib Dem majority government, we will revoke Article 50. And if you don't, we will argue for a people's vote.
But for Nicola Sturgeon, it was about Scottish independence. As she says, Boris Johnson's main rival would be likely to agree to a referendum if he was to form a coalition with the SNP.
I would ask for and expect Jeremy Corbyn to respect the right of the Scottish people to choose their own future, because it's not for Westminster to decide, it's for the people of Scotland.
The party leaders will be taking part in at least 3 more debates before the British people head to the polls on December 12th.
That's it from the newsroom. Thanks for watching, and please stay tuned to France 24.